Hello,
Hello,
I'm Alex,
I'm Val.
and today we're going to talk about the episode Amour Fou, or as I just wrote the file name, Amour 4. But it's actually Amour Fou.
Amour Fou, Crazy Love, season 3, episode 12,
That's right.
a penultimate,
Getting very close to the end of season 3.
basically the end of season
Basically the end.
3. But this is a great episode. Sopranos basically created the penultimate episode arc,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah, the idea of kind of like having the most important action of a season in the penultimate episode and then seeing the kind of like results of that unfold in your final episode.
No, it's great.
Yeah.
How do we want to talk about this one today?
Well, it's a really interesting episode, and I think there's a lot going on. I mean, upon watching this, I was saying to you, I think last time I watched the show from start to end, the thing that really blew me away was season 1. Just like right away, just like how punchy and how tight it was, and how all of their ideas are thrown out, and they really are like a very clear idea of what the show is going to be, and it's done in this very kind of like effective way that's just really kind of linked to itself in terms of everything that's going on. This time I'm watching, I feel like season 3 is like I'm having kind of a similar impact on myself where I'm just like blown away by the quality of this season.
Yeah.
And I feel like everything that they develop and introduce in season 1 is now benefiting from the fact that they've been working on it for a while, and they're just kind of like in their prime.
Yeah.
I just feel like it's just everything is being done at the highest level. And in Pine Barrens and in this episode, in a similar way, like I actually feel that this episode for me is just as strong as Pine Barrens as an episode.
Yeah, we didn't really touch on that when we talked about Pine Barrens in our last episode. But like it's definitely a standout, like it definitely has a standout storyline. It's definitely like an incredible episode, so don't get me wrong on this one at all. But there's so many episodes that stand out to me like that. It's really like if you asked me my top 10, it would be really hard for me to do that.
Yeah.
And again, I think because different ones speak to you at different times in life and stuff like that too. Like obviously, like there's a reason why Pine Barrens is so lauded the way or acclaimed the way it is. But yeah, this episode for me is like the two of them as a pair is really nice.
It's amazing
in some ways too.
And actually they're very interestingly linked because the Italian aria that happens at the end of Pine Barrens starts off this episode at the Brooklyn Museum. And I'm sorry to everybody. So first of all, I'm sorry to all the French people for accidentally writing that this episode is called Amour Fou. And now I'm sorry to all of our Italian listeners for saying that the aria is called Spozza so disprezzata.
Cool.
Sorry, everyone. But that's the aria that is at the end of Pine Barrens in the scene where we see Polly being very contemplative with the trees kind of passing in the background of the car. And now the aria is being used at the Brooklyn Museum where we have Carmela kind of in a similarly contemplative state looking at a lot of art. And actually, it's interesting because when she's looking at this I'm just going to ruin everything today, but I'm doing my best. The Giuseppe de Ribera, the mystical marriage of St. Catherine, and she starts crying. For me, that's kind of like similar to what Pine Barrens is for Polly. It's like forcing her to confront something outside of her own world.
Oh, that's really interesting.
It's like forcing her to confront these more like eternal questions.
Yeah, but in some ways, like it is something in her own world. Like it's how she's chosen to deal with these larger issues in life.
Totally.
Right?
It's
like,
completely different
and Polly kind of deals with his shit in a little more like whatever, like spiritual or something way, right? Like he has his own ideas and theories about mortality and all these issues as well. So I don't know, it is interesting that like this is a pensive moment for both of them with that soundtrack scoring it.
Yeah. And I think maybe, like what they're considering and what is relevant to them is different, but they're both kind of like confronting this almost like mystical layer or level to their existence that they're being confronted with.
I think that's a great point. I love that this episode starts at the Brooklyn Museum.
Yeah.
First of all, it's a great museum.
Yeah.
But second of all, it does kind of, I think, give us, it kind of sets us up to like think about the art and stuff like that are in this episode.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're always looking at, I mean, we like art, but we're always looking out for art in this show because it's often really meaningful.
Yeah.
And we definitely see some art behind the characters in this episode. Like, not to mention at the museum where we see lots of different things passing by.
And also the Rodin exhibit is interesting.
Right,
that
yeah,
they start
the
off at.
Rodin
And actually,
sculptures,
we'll
yeah.
get back to that later, but actually that had me thinking of something that the use of Rodin was even somewhat intentional too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't see we don't see what Meadow responds to at the museum. Like, we don't see her really, except for, I guess, the woman, like the wife of the merchant.
Well,
painting,
she doesn't
right?
respond to that.
Yeah.
In some ways. Like, she has a negative response.
Yeah. She's also kind of looking a lot like a 90s rock chick. So
That's cool.
I don't know what the meaning of that, like an angsty girl rocker.
Interesting.
Yeah. I guess since her breakup with Jackie.
Now she's has a whole new identity.
I guess so. But yeah, but we don't see her response. We do see Carmela's, right? And we see her get really emotional.
Yeah.
About this painting, right? And I love like Meadows' comments about it, right? Because it's the mystical marriage of Saint Catherine. What's it called?
Yeah,
they make a point.
Saint Catherine, yeah.
They make a point of announcing
saying,
the
which
title,
is rare for this show.
Yeah, but you know, it's this painting of baby Jesus, and I guess Mary on the right, and then Saint Catherine on the left.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, Meadows' responses are really funny. Like, she's marrying a baby. good luck. But then, you know, it kind of gets deep into Carmela's, like, you know, relationship issues when she's like, we all do. And she talks about
this innocent, gorgeous little baby and then starts to cry.
I don't know. Yeah, it's interesting because, like, I try to think about it in the context of, like, she's thinking about her marriage to Tony.
Yeah.
But then I don't like it. Her marriage to Tony is not a little innocent baby, and I don't think Tony was never an innocent little baby.
Yeah.
Even when they first got together.
There's something, for me, what it makes me think of is like the use of a baby as a representation of innocence, and it's something that she can't go back to. This is totally just like an interpretation that I have, but it's something that I feel like we've seen in movies before too. Like, it's actually like kind of a common symbol sometimes, and even psychologically, like I think people do have difficulties seeing children and interpreting like happy children or babies because it's like a time of your life where you have no responsibilities and you can't go back to it. It's kind of like a clean slate. I'm trying to think of a movie like that movie we just saw, It Follows. That's a funny reference to make, but like that's a movie that's like very heavy in symbolism, right? And actually they use like water and a lot of the time like kids, like there's even like statements about it. Like that's just an example because I think it's actually kind of like a basic kind of thing that shows up from time to time of like people being uncomfortable with seeing people in that stage of their life, like a kind of jealousy.
Yeah. I think too, like, so I think that's a great point. And I definitely think that's relevant. I think there's another kind of layer of it too, which is I think like Carmela, even though she feels very close to the church and that's something that she like really wants to identify with, like she never had a chance to have this like real innocent relationship with Jesus, right? Like Saint Catherine, I guess is. I don't know the story behind that story, even though I'm Catholic-ish. But she never, or was, I don't know. But like she was never able to have that like honest and innocent relationship because of who she is married to, right?
Yeah.
Like, so, and I think we see her kind of acknowledging that in this episode when she's talking with her priest later on, this new priest, who, you know, is telling her she should not divorce at any cost, right? And she's like, wow, the church has changed a lot. Yeah. You know? So she's kind of like, I think like mourning her loss of that capacity as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could extend to multiple different domains too, but it's like, it's just like that innocence is definitely something that it represents.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I don't know. I just would have loved to know like Meadows' response to paintings.
Totally, yeah. And actually, I mean, sorry, just similarly on that, there's actually like talk a lot of like babies in this episode. Like there's even like certain other things, like talking about like Irina as a helpless fucking baby.
I noted that too. Yeah. And I mean, like it's even with, I know this is like, I mean, crying is totally okay, guys. Everyone can cry, but like there's a lot of crying in this episode, right? And different characters kind of like crying for different reasons, which is interesting. We don't typically see that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, definitely. Okay. What do you have next? What do you think?
One other thing that I wrote down. Sorry. Tony, when he's talking with Melfi about, or Melfi's asking him like, why do you think Gloria likes you? Right? Maybe I want to talk about Melfi and Gloria and everyone, but he makes a point to say like, he's not a crybaby.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I was like, one other thing.
Yeah, there's definitely some scattered references there.
Yeah.
And actually, yeah, in the merchant's wife, like I was actually thinking about that too, in terms of like what's being commented on and seen in the gallery kind of comes back to reflect certain scenes and dynamics between people. But the conversation between the mob wives about like Hillary Clinton and how she spun that shit into gold.
Yeah.
And how she's a role model for
all of us. Yeah.
And you know, it's really interesting because like here we have Carmela, right? And it's clearly, I think that's something that hits hard for her, that Meadow rejects that
like way of
role
life or something
for a woman of like just being able to attach to power. In fact, like this is something that kind of comes up again and again.
Well,
like
yeah, because so Gloria
has this. Well, Gloria has this like very aggressive comment where she's like, well, and I wrote it down, but at least your daughter doesn't have to latch on to a man for a success.
Yeah.
Right? So she's kind of like attacking her. And now that's related to what Carmela saw of this merchant's wife talking about, and then Meadow kind of going against it.
Yeah.
And then later when they're also talking about Hillary Clinton and how she's a role model for them for kind of like taking this bad and turning it into something for herself, it's really interesting. And even in terms of like their relationships too, like the way that they're talking about how they cope with them, like how things have changed from generation, from Carmela to Meadow, but how Carmela's just like uncomfortable with who she is, and the decisions she's made and the life that she leads. But she's talking about Meadow and she's saying like, you know, like they're different than we were talking to, you know, all of our friends,
all the
like
girls,
no sleepless nights, no weight loss. And
Yeah.
that's like a really interesting thing because Meadow is like has more agency or something in this. But what's also interesting is that I think is happening in this episode is the people who are dumped are going to deal with it really badly. And actually really bad things are about to happen to the two characters, Gloria and Jackie.
Right. Exactly.
So that was kind of an interesting thing that I saw happening and kind of connected. The connections in this episode are like kind of unreal, actually.
Totally.
And I think that's where we've talked about these kind of like these dyads, these kind of coupling of characters or maybe themes that have happened this whole season. But now the way that they play off of each other is just kind of mind-boggling.
Yeah.
To be able to track all the connections, it's...
Well, and it's interesting, too, in light of what Melfi then says later in the last session of this episode with Tony. And she says, like, they're talking about Carmela, and he's like, well, maybe I'm restless. Like, maybe I want out.
Right.
And she says, maybe she might leave you, but you'll never leave her. Right. And so, again, like classifying Tony as one of these people who would be like the left person or the dumped person.
Interesting.
Right. And
that's,
like,
yeah.
And like not the downfall, but like the collateral would be from that for Tony, right? Like Carmela would be fine. Right?
Interesting to think about that relationship, like who's who.
Yeah. No, it is. I think it is really interesting.
Yeah, those things that Melfi says at the end, I think are really indicative of her being kind of a new character. Like, she's a different person in this episode.
I want to talk about Melfi, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I think that in this episode, her body language and the clothing that she's wearing is totally different than what we've had before. There's no mixed messages from the clothing. Like, earlier I think that it's been intentional. Like, she's worn, you know, short dresses compared to suits or whatever to reflect the relationship between her and Tony.
Yeah.
Now it's like fully professional, like full kind of like suit clothing, different kind of like solid colors. No kind of like of those like kind of like
beigey colors.
Yeah, those kind of like low, kind of like mellow, kind of monotone things.
Yeah.
But also, like, she's just like laying down the law. Like, she's just like kind of like claiming all these things about Tony that she's observed that are kind of accurate. There's none of this kind of like mixed up, problematic relationship that's kind of happened in the past between her questionable relationship to him in terms of like romantic or being mixed up with her reasons for doing this. It just seems like she's actually being a full professional right now.
Yeah, see, that's so interesting. And like, I definitely see where you're coming from on that.
Mm-hmm.
But I, in this episode, was really questioning her professionalism. Like I do often. I think like, obviously she's a problematic character in a lot of ways. But I was like, shit, like, would she, like, now she knows that her two patients are dating, like, would she still treat them? Or, like, is that professional of her to discuss the other person at all in their sessions? Like, I don't know. I'd love to ask someone in the field. Like, I want to ask a psychiatrist and be like, would this be a thing? Because for me, that actually, like, she seems to kind of, like, gain power from it in some way. And we know, like we talked a little bit about how, like, was that really a mistake that she, like, double booked them, right? Like, that there's something in her subconscious maybe that's, like, kind of thrives on it. And she does, like, because in this episode she really does come out, like, way more strongly than she ever does before, and says some really, I think, like, very true and honest things. But, like, there is something where, like, or maybe it was just kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, and like she just sees Tony more for who he is now, because of what he's doing with Gloria. But I love the way she unpacks with them, or with Tony rather, like, why do you like her and why do you think she likes you? Yeah. And I think she's like thriving in this environment where I guess maybe she just has like a good foil or something. I don't know.
I think there's something too that changed in Employee of the Month. Like, the power dynamic is different now. Yeah. So when Melfi has accepted that she would not call on Tony for his services to go to kind of circumvent the law, something changes because she now has power over him. Yes. There's nothing that she would use him for. Yes. And I think that things change from there. And I think actually Melfi's character as a whole, like, her arc is greatly affected by that episode. Yeah. Like, everything is kind of like leading there. Absolutely. And it's kind of a different story after that. So their relationship is different. It is more professional. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, there's something there though that, like, I don't know. There's something there that makes me like, and like on paper she's doing all, like, she's giving Tony free therapy because he overpaid the month before, so right? That's really interesting too, actually. Yeah, because that's like closure to that moral conundrum that we found her in an earlier episode. Like, that's actually exactly kind of what I'm talking about. Yeah. Like, she's again asserting herself as somebody outside of Tony's orbit. Yeah. Whereas before she was drawn into it and unable to kind of escape. But I think she is still, like, she's even kind of more drawn into it now in some ways. Like, now it's like she has these two patients who are, like, she's, like, much more intimately involved. Whereas, like, before she met Carmela, that was just, like, a abstraction, right? Like, she knows these two people. Yeah. And we don't see, I mean, we see her session with Gloria in 2 episodes ago. We see her have a session with Gloria, but we don't see her have another session with Gloria again. Yeah. So we don't know what she's talking with Gloria about. Right. But yeah, there's something that just, like, didn't sit right with me with those scenes. But at the same time, like, I love the things Melfi had to say. And the things Tony had to say about Gloria were also really interesting, right? Like, at first he's putting himself out there and saying that he loves her independence, that she's not like Irina, who's a baby, apparently. She does Buddhism stuff. She went to Morocco all by herself. She's like a Spanish princess. And then they have that interaction where he and Melfi are, like, I don't know, like, Melfi's kind of trying to fill in his blanks, right? Like, he says, like, her eyes are dark and she's really deep. And Melfi's like, oh, complicated. Yeah. And he's like, no, you said complicated. And then later on, he calls her complicated, right? Mm-hmm. So, again, in that, like, I loved the exchange, and the acting is incredible. But then at the same time, I was like, oh, I think they're both, like, Melfi knows too much about the other person to be neutral, I guess, or something. Anyways. Mm-hmm.
But I did love that interaction.
Yeah, totally.
And I love when she says, like, don't you, like, she says it better than me, but, like, is it plausible to you that there are certain types of people who are drawn to fire? Right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And she's the one who introduces the term Amour Fou in this.
Yeah.
Too.
Yeah.
So, you know, and that's the title of the episode, and kind of something that I think is something like rather central to a lot of the relationships here, because like there's more than just Tony and Gloria and even, you know, Meadow and Jackie. Like there's Jackie's relationship to Ralphie and the mob and even his father. And like people are kind of having these like crazy instincts to do all sorts of things. And I think that like that kind of like crazy passionate behavior is something that kind of actually ties together all of these disparate storylines. Yeah,
no, absolutely. I wanted to talk a little bit about Gloria more too, if we can.
We can do that. That'd be great.
I think it's interesting, like how she's able to like manipulate Tony throughout the episode. She really makes him like flip and flop from one thing to the other, like very skillfully. Like she starts out like approaching him in the parking lot of Melfi's office, right? And he tells her to go fuck herself. But then she's like, well, I've just had a really bad week. Like I've had problems with my family. And then Tony's like right back on board. They have that really hilarious interaction where they're lying in bed. This is not really about her manipulating as much, but I love when she and Tony are talking and he's like, it's okay if you don't want to talk about it.
Right.
But then she launches into this whole story about her sister and her crackhead husband, and then he out of nowhere mentions like we had a new Santa at Satrial. Like,
didn't work out.
It didn't work out, right? He's like he's like trying to blow weird smoke rings and stuff like that. He asks like, what did Seamus have to say? But Gloria's really good at reading, like she's actually like really good at reading situations, I think, and she's like very manipulative and she knows how to play people really well. Like the look on her face when she realized, like when she's mad at him for the potential Irina tire slashing. When Tony tells her that he hit her. You see this like glimmer on her face.
She's like content about it. Like she's happy that she got there. I feel like that was her goal.
Well, this is the thing. Like she's pushing. She's able to manipulate him and push him in these like really polarized directions, right? Like she can make him be very sympathetic and like more sympathetic than we see him be at other times, like and seem to really care. And then we can see him flip to like the complete opposite side with her. So it's really crazy. And then of course when she like calls him sobbing, crying, right? Like again, like a baby, but
basically just saying nonsense,
just not even speaking, right? And he comes over, and then that's when that scene, you know, he comes over to really like, you know, like he was still trying to tell her like it's over. I don't think he like had any plans to change his mind, but he was coming over to make sure she was okay. And then she flips it so that, you know, then she brings up the stuff. That's when I think she brings up the stuff about how she saw Carmela, right? Or no.
Well, no, she says, as Tony is leaving, like her last...
She says, I'm going to tell your wife. Or I'm going to call your wife. So, she's just like... She's an amazing manipulator. I don't know really what else to say about it, but...
the thing that actually really blows me away about that, though, that I loved is like in the end when Tony sends Patsy Parisi in the car, it's really an example of Tony actually kind of psychologically understanding her and actually kind of figuring
and knowing
her
what would
out,
get to her,
and then using that against her in a way to know that he won't have any problems, like sending Philly Parisi. And it's interesting that there's actually like trees in the back as they're driving, similar to what Polly was considering in the last episode of Pine Barrens.
Similar to another episode we'll see in the future.
But where he says it won't be cinematic, like understanding her need for the drama. And for being kind of at the center of it, and for this kind of like larger than life thing. And then being able to kind of like weaponize that against her. Is interesting.
Well, I like how too, like that really, like Tony doesn't like that, right? Like like Tony probably wanted to kill her in that moment until she said kill me, and he
Right.
kind of like realized that was what was going on.
Yeah.
And again, it's like part of his realization that he's known her all along, right? Like,
Yeah. There's
he's
something
known
really
her.
interesting actually for me about that scene, like
Yeah.
where Gloria's saying "kill me." I mean, it's so difficult to watch,
Yeah.
but when Tony is being violent and he pushes her over and he pushes her on the ground, and they kind of like flips her over.
Yeah.
There's something kind of like, as violent as it is, just the way that it's portrayed, there's like a quasi-sexual thing
Yeah.
kind of about the way that it comes across.
Yeah.
And I think that is just indicative of what that relationship is. It's this
Yeah.
weird kind of like sexual violent relationship that is just like bound for disaster,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Well, like he even calls her a dangerous fuck, which is kind of a play on words.
Right.
But
Right. Yeah.
that is what it is, right? And
Interesting.
Melfi
It's those two
questions,
things, yeah.
like Melfi questions that I think pretty deeply, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why are you drawn to these like why are you putting your relationship in such danger,
Yeah.
right?
Amour Fou.
Amour Fou. Yeah. But then like Tony also really knows what's going on. Like he says to Melfi, she wanted me to kill her,
Yeah.
right? He calls her a bottomless black hole.
Yeah.
He, like he's also a manipulator. He wasn't really very well able to manipulate her though.
Yeah.
Just
Well, until the very end.
I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was like manipulation or
Maybe, yeah, but just an
like-
understanding, I guess, and
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
playing
no,
off of that.
exactly.
Yeah, you're right.
No, you're right.
It's actually
You're
very
right, too.
forceful.
Yeah.
I was thinking too. Actually, it was interesting. Like when Tony said, when he was asked, "Why do you think she's attracted to you?" and he states that it's like, "Well, I'm not a crybaby. I'm not that."
Yeah.
It was interesting actually in the context of like now being in 2018 and having all sorts of questions of like political correctness and identity in different cultural groups. The fact that actually what was referenced there was that when she was talking about how she was upset with her sister and her husband, how the thing that set her off that Christmas was the C word, and then she
yeah.
like flips out.
Yeah.
Just thinking of like Tony and her existing in those kind of cultural zones
Yeah.
where actually like the political correctness is like they are resenting that.
Yeah, they
and
don't
actually,
fit in with that. Yeah.
And that's actually expanded on later. There's actually the episode on Christopher Columbus and Italian
Right.
Americans' relationship to him.
right.
But it's
yeah.
interesting to think about like that's actually a very important thing to those people, to Tony and to
Yeah.
Gloria, and that brings them together.
Yeah.
But Tony as a character is this kind of like macho, conservative, as Melfi says, like a traditional man in a lot of
Right.
sense. But he's coming from a different time, and his values incorporate those things being important.
Yeah. These are complicated times.
Complicated people,
Yeah.
complicated times. Also, Tony calls Goya Goya.
Yes.
That was
he
pretty
does.
funny.
He does. What else? What do we want? So there was a lot of like interesting visual stuff here. So this is a Tim Van Patten directed episode.
Yep.
Um,
We have the DP is our good friend, the Russian assistant
yeah,
bookkeeper,
We're so into that.
Alik Sakharov.
There's a really great cut. Like it comes quite. I wish I had jotted down what time it fell at, but after the scene with Christopher and Tony, which maybe we can talk about too, right? When Chris is like really incensed by this, that like Jackie Jr. tried to hit this, like took a shot at him, hit Furia, whatever.
Yeah.
And that Tony's not doing anything because of the relationship, or seems to not be doing anything because of the scene with Jackie, or because of the scenario with Jackie Sr.
Yeah.
We have a cut to this like time-lapse sky, right? Like, which we don't see shots like that very often.
Yeah.
Like it goes from being night to being morning, right? And this time has passed. And that's when then Tony and Syl and Ralph, well, I guess Syl leaves, but he's there in the beginning, where they have the scene where Tony and Ralphie sit down together.
Right.
And are discussing kind of what's going to happen. I don't know. It was just like, it was like at a cut point in the episode that felt like it was this like resolution kind of time was coming. I don't know. There was something, like all this action had happened, right? Like with, the shoot. I mean, that was a really intense shootout, right?
Yeah.
All the action had already happened with, with Gloria and like saying kill me, right? We have these like really intense scenes. And then we have this cut, right? And we have that whole scene, and we can talk about that scene too. And then after that, it's really this like descent towards that scene with Melfi saying like, you know, you'll never leave her, she'll leave you.
Right.
The scene where Patsy, you know, comes to Gloria and takes her to threaten her. We have like at the final scene with Tony and Carmela where she's reading the real estate book, and then it's the end of the episode. So there is something there, like, I don't know, at least arc wise, like it's showing us how we're kind of like trying to wrap things up in this season too.
Interesting. You missed my favorite part of the whole episode, and maybe actually visually one of my favorite moments of the entire show so far.
No, I was gonna. I said we can talk about that scene. I was gonna let
well,
you
just
talk
visually.
about
Well, no, just because it's so close to the ones you were talking about.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, so when Ralphie and Tony are talking,
yeah,
totally. But I want to expand.
I know
there's
there's powerful scenes in that sequence. Yeah,
just visually, there's something that I just love so much, and I actually. I don't think we've ever said this before, but like if you've watched the episode and you're listening, I actually highly recommend going back and finding this shot because it's like it's art.
It's so beautiful.
And that's the point. It's supposed to be art. And the fact that there's allusions and there's references to visual art in this episode is not a coincidence because there's a couple shots that I think are constructed like a painting.
Yes.
So around 50 minutes, you have Tony meeting with Ralph, and it's unbelievable because like just the sophistication of this show to have something that's such a powerful image visually that is like kind of a throwaway. It's like 3 or 4 seconds, but it's like a perfect shot that actually like communicates so much in this one thing. And it is like a painting, and it's up to us to deconstruct
Well, before that we see like it goes from Tony's face to Ralphie's face, Tony's face to Ralphie's face, but then you're left at the end of it and you see the two of them sitting across the table from each other.
And this is the shot, They're
framed, and we've talked about this before, like when there's two characters like that,
there's often something in between them or behind them,
yeah, or
just something that is like a focal point, of the composition.
And so we thought that might be two different things, you and I, when we were watching it.
Well, so it's the shot. If you're looking for it, it is about at 50 minutes, and you have the like classic Italian American like white red kind of like tablecloth, you know,
in
kind
the
of
foreground,
like probably taking up about like I don't know, about a quarter of the whole shot. But what's amazing, so you have Tony and Ralph looking at each other, and for me, in between them on the back of the wall is like what looks like a fish to me, or like at least in the shape of a fish, almost like the like caricature of one, like a Jesus fish or something, but something on the wall, which as they're dealing with the death of Jackie, and what Ralphie should do, I think is really interesting because there's just so much happening in that scene.
Yeah.
First of all, Tony is wrestling with his promise to Jackie Jr.'s father that he would protect him, and the fact that he's kind of like loading this off onto Ralphie is a way that he can kind of kill two birds with one stone. He likely knows what will have to be done, what Ralphie has to do, but he's also protecting him by not being the one who actively chooses to kill him or orders to kill him. So
and you see Ralphie doing that contemplating this, right? You can see him actively like thinking about this.
And I think that fish, like there is a specter of death over that meeting, and that's something that they have to deal with. You picked up on something amazing there, the cigar.
Well, I just thought I was staring at the shot because it was so beautiful, and the thing that my eyes were drawn towards was there's a cigar between them. It's Tony's cigar, and we've talked about when Tony smokes cigars, like often.
It's him in a position, of control or a moment of feeling in control.
But the cigar there is like pointing right towards Tony, the way it's laid in the ashtray. And so I really saw that as like, again, like showing who's going to come out on top, or like whose desires are going to be
for me. I feel like it's Tony manipulating successfully, like he is in control, and he is the one who's like dictating how this will all go, even though he states that he's handing it off to Ralphie and it's his decision. He is actually a manipulator in this sense, and he's doing it effectively. He's fully in control. And then just the acting too, like the positions that they're in terms of body language, for me it relates to Rodin actually at the beginning.
They both have their hands to their heads, like in this like
and actually
thinker kind of pose.
But interestingly, like Tony is kind of staring down Ralphie, and Ralphie is actually like in the thinker pose, like in contemplation about what to do.
Yeah.
And then when he leaves, we actually have, and who knows if this was actually there in New Jersey or they put it, because I think it's definitely intentional, the path sign with an arrow right outside as he
Right.
leaves. And then Ralphie's kind of like struck in contemplation, and then he chooses to walk in the direction, and he follows the arrow for the path. And I think he is walking the path. He has no choice, but he has to walk the path that's set out for him as a member of the mob family.
Yeah.
He can't protect Jackie. And for me, in that moment, Jackie's fate is kind of sealed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just in terms of like and I think it's all being kind of represented there. And we're all kind of just given a lot of foreshadowing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's really, I really do. Like, actually, like, we should even try to get, like, a screen grab of it. It's so beautiful.
Yeah.
We'll see if we can do that.
Our technological savvy might be a little bit lacking.
A little lacking. It'll be like a cell phone picture of the
Yeah.
TV screen. That'll be beautiful.
Yeah.
We'll see.
So, and that ties into what Ralphie's doing at the very end of the episode when he goes to meet with Rosalie. And he's talking to her about what is happening to her son. And he's kind of like preparing her, talking about how he's involved in drugs.
Yeah.
But what's interesting there is there's another example of everything kind of being linked in this network, all kind of being connected all at once at the end of this season. Because there's a lot of rings there, which is the first thing that we see. We see Carmela's ring at the very beginning of the episode. Mm-hmm. And now we see, as Ralphie is kind of consoling Rosalie, we see actually a pretty wild shot. Well, first of all, we see Ralphie wearing a ring that actually is...
But then, like, it was, for me, like, because then you see Gloria's hand around Ralphie's back, and I'm like...
Gloria's hand around Ralphie's back.
Sorry, yeah.
That would be weird.
Oh my gosh, Rosalie, it's late.
Sometimes we do these very late at night.
We always do these
We always do
very
these
late
very
at
late at night, and sometimes we mix up names. Rosalie.
Rosalie's hand, and I'm like, is she wearing a wedding ring?
Yeah,
and
she is.
It's like an engagement ring. I don't think it's like a wedding band, right?
Yeah.
But I was like, that reads as strange, right? It's on her left hand, but she's in this other relationship. She's not engaged to Ralphie, as far as I know.
No, I guess it's still to, I think it's
to like
still
honor
to
Jackie Sr.
But
yeah.
her, her with the ring, and that shot is like it's very intentional. I mean, they spend a lot of time. It's almost like the equivalent of those extreme close-ups that we've talked about a lot, where there's something of importance, and it's typically on a character's face.
It's as long as that beautiful shot we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like her finger ring right in the middle of the frame. And then, but early, we see Ralphie with this ring, and they're all kind of like set up the same way.
I bet you the priest was wearing a ring.
Probably.
Well, he was.
I think a lot of
he
people
was
probably
eyeing
were.
Carmela's ring.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, then that's the thing. It's like this is all made more relevant by the fact that Carmela's ring is such a focused on symbol in this episode. So I mean, there's a lot of connection there.
And then directly following that scene, I think, with Ralphie and Rosalie, we go to the scene with Tony and Carmela in the kitchen, where Carmela's sitting at the table and she's reading this real estate book, right? So, and we'll talk about that in a sec, but then she's not wearing her ring, and Tony comments on it, right? I think she lies. I don't think it's actually...
She says she's getting it sized because it was too big, but that's like true and not true.
Yeah, but she's like, so interestingly in this episode, right, like we see a pretty big shift for a huge shift for Carmela, I think, where, she doesn't know who Gloria is, but Gloria has said these things to her about, like, at least, not having to latch onto a man.
Yeah.
She's had these conversations about Hillary Clinton with the rest of the ladies, like we were talking about earlier. And she suddenly is interested in doing something outside of just being a homemaker, or whatever a homemaker.
Must be a very nice home.
It must be very...
To drive a Benz.
Yeah, it must be. That she's taken off the ring and she is pursuing something that isn't, bought for her like the rings are, right? Like that she's trying to make something of herself apart from Tony. Yeah. There's no comment on it. All we see is she doesn't say to Tony, like, hey, I'm going to try to get my real estate license.
There's something interesting about the rings. I feel like the rings in some ways represent the shackles that all of these characters have in terms of their relationships. Like, we have Carmela, who's shackled. That's why I think it's
interesting that Carmela takes hers off.
Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating. Absolutely. And especially in comparison to Rosalie and Ralphie, because I think Ralphie is shackled by his relationship to the mob, and he's wearing the symbol of it. Yes. I think that Rosalie is shackled to her past relationship to Jackie Sr., which is also tying her and her son to the mob, and ultimately that connection has brought the downfall of her son, Jackie Jr.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I don't really have.
I have some things. So
Okay.
I mean, we can go more into detail for sure on Jackie Jr. I think.
Yeah.
I have quite a bit on that. I mean, multiple things. Like again, like in the earlier on in the episode when he's like in the pizza place and he kind of like calls out his anger against these people that are there and breaks all these glasses. For me, that was like visually a representation too of like how fragile his situation is.
Yeah.
And the collateral damage of like this person's building something for 20 years and he's just like he's a whirlwind. He's out of control.
He's totally out
and
of
it's
control.
like there are fragile things around him that are all being smashed by his like kind of like youthful exuberance and just like lack of
Well, even when they're making that hit later on, like he's like, okay, let's do it before the crank wears off. Like he's a maniac. Like he's a total he's a total maniac. He has zero control.
We get that story too of I mean, he's getting the information from Melfi about how his dad and Tony ripped off Feach Lamanna, who will be a character later on in series 2. So that's like an interesting thing where they introduce somebody who we won't see still for a while. The big thing for me that I want to talk about with Jackie that I thought was really interesting is this combo of Jackie and Dino. Which it's actually very kind of similar to the relationship between Matt and Sean in season 2.
Even when they're watching that Basic Instinct scene, right?
Exactly.
Like, and it was, and he was like, "Don't touch me," or like, "Get out of
it's like that scene where Matt and Sean are smoking their bongs, and Furio comes in and like emasculates them. And for me, there's still, I think it's proving the same point and actually linking Jackie to those characters. Like he needs to prove himself, but there is actually like, even though they're watching Basic Instinct and it's, about Sharon Stone. Well, it's not about Sharon Stone, but they're watching it for Sharon Stone.
It's a biopic about Sharon Stone.
Well, I don't think they're watching it for that. But anyway, there's, for me, something that's still kind of like homoerotic about them watching it together, being there, similarly to the way that they portrayed Matt and Sean.
And the acting and the filming of that scene really does indicate that to you. Like they like linger a little too long. And Jackie kind of like weirdly settles into his seat. Like it is.
Yeah, and they're both on a couch like similar in a similar even like in a similar way to Matt and Sean were in that point. And that actually, fascinatingly, is what drove those two to want to whack Chris. Because Furio emasculates them. And that I think is really key. Because I think Jackie, he even talks about like Ralphie, I think he might be gay. Like he's trying to prove himself. He's trying to show his masculinity and his dominance. And that's what gets these characters into trouble. Like they're afraid of their image of being gay or something, and then they act out in this like extreme way, but in trying to prove their masculinity, they just end up killing themselves.
Well, I love how, I mean, it's kind of an aside in some ways, but I love how the doctor who they have on call to even like
prick doctor,
like the doctor prick doctor. No, he's an erectile dysfunction doctor, right? And so it is that like manhood. Manliness, right? Like this is who they need in their life to fix their problems, is this guy who like deals with impotence and deals with like erectile
that was really interesting,
like a lack of manliness. It's really interesting.
That was fascinating because that doctor was playing in the executive game in a previous episode of Sopranos, and I thought that there's a lot going on there. I feel like this is a point where like this web is really just all kind of being connected. But like, so not only is there a link to, like what was happening there with the game that they're robbing, but the fact that they focus on that doctor and he's like talking like a professional, and then we kind of like zoom out and see that he's acting and that it's on a set. Like, I feel like everybody's acting out this kind of like idea of what professionalism or masculinity is. There's something very like false about it. Like he's being a surgeon, but he's actually a prick doctor. As somebody called him.
Well, I think Furio said this doctor's a prick.
Okay. We have Matoush driving. Bad driver. Matoush, who we saw at the Crazy Horse. We have all these like bit parts coming back. Matoush, who got kicked out, and keep an eye on him. Keep an eye on any Matoush scenes, because he ends up being relevant to some things that happen later on.
He's relevant.
He's a bad getaway driver, though. It's too bad. Maybe, things would have been different if he didn't get away, if he had stayed.
Yeah, maybe.
I just have some stray observations.
Okay.
I have The Tony and Chris, when Chris is challenging Tony actually
Yeah.
on his thoughts about Jackie
Yeah.
Jr., that painting, I think we need to talk about that.
Yeah,
That's behind them.
Like a pretty stormy looking painting.
But it's interesting. Like, there's definitely two entities on it.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like confronting each other or something.
Yeah.
It's abstract, but it's almost like behind the two characters, and it's like these two amorphous clouds that are kind of like colliding.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting one. And we know that, like, you know, like, I think it's Jackie Jr. or it's Dino who comments earlier, like, Chris is someone who isn't afraid to, like, say what he feels or something like that. Like, they value him for that.
Right.
And he actually does stand out for that. He does say when he thinks that things are not correct.
And he's
And
actually...
I think that drives him, I mean, like, well, whatever, Christopher's arc, but, like, that drives him to a place that I think starting at this point actually changes really drastically.
Well, it's interesting because he's one of the few characters who will take on Tony, and that's what's talked about why Tony is attracted to Glory, because she takes him on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, very few people do it. Most people are kind of yes men around Tony.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. It's really interesting. And that scene's really intense.
The other thing I loved, which was just, I mean, very subtle, but the scene of, this is completely unrelated, Carm and Gloria in the car, the, like, dialogue, the way it's written is Carm saying, "This is very sweet of you," and the response to that is, "Don't believe it." I forget why it makes sense, the way that she says, "Don't believe it," but it's like, is great. Like, just like the way that they communicate.
No,
Actually,
it makes
she's
sense.
being
She's
very...
like, don't think that I'm just sweet. She's like, don't believe it.
Well, that is what she's saying, but I
Yeah.
think there's also like a double entendre. Like, there's a
Right.
way that it reflects like the conversation
Right.
that makes sense. But Gloria's actually being very forthright. Like, she's actually like attacking Carm, but in this underhanded way that she's very good at.
No, she's amazing at it. I have one more thing to
Yeah.
say, and it's a really important update about a character who we don't see in this episode.
Oh my god.
But Noah Tenenbaum has a 4.0, and he's moving to India with the UN.
Are you happy? Are you happy for him?
He sounds like the kind of guy who, after his second year of university, would go and do an internship with the UN.
It's great. I mean, it sounds amazing.
Yeah, good for Noah Tenenbaum.
Yeah. You sound sincerely happy for him. I'm
I
glad.
am.
I'm glad for both of you.
Yeah, it's very good.
Noah Tenenbaum. Wow.
That's all, though. That's all I have.
Yeah, well, we love the episode. It's an incredible season, and I can't believe how good the end of it is. The end of season 3 is some of the best television of all time, I think. So we really hope you're enjoying it as much as us.
Yeah, and we'll see you for the season finale next time.
We'll see you next time. If you're enjoying the show, please rate and review. Helps people find the podcast. And we really appreciate it. And we'll see you next time.